This is part 11 of Entity Framework tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss entity splitting with code-first approach. Entity splitting refers to mapping an entity to two or more tables when the tables share a common key. We discussed entity splitting with database-first approach in part 10. In this video, we'll discuss entity splitting with code-first approach. Now, let's say we have this employee class. By default, Entity Framework code-first is going to create one table with name employees. And notice that all the properties are mapped to the columns within that table. Let's actually look at this in action. So let's flip to Visual Studio. So here I have an empty ASP.NET Web Application project. So to this project, let's add a class file and let's call this employee.cs. And this class is going to contain employee ID, first name, last name, gender, email, mobile, and landline properties. Now to this project, let's add another class file and let's call this employee.db.context.cs. And this class is going to inherit from db.context class, and that class is present in system.data.entity namespace. So let's make this class inherit from db.context, and this class is going to contain a property which is going to return a DB set of employee objects, and let's call this property employees. Alright, now let's add another class and let's call this employee repository. And basically this class is going to contain methods to get employees, to insert, update, and delete employees. And in the interest of time, I have already typed the code for those methods. We have discussed all these methods in the previous sessions of this video series, so I'm not going to go into the details of these methods. So let me copy and paste the code right here, and then we'll quickly go over it. So basically we are creating an instance of the employee DB context class that we have just created. And within get employees, we are getting the employees list and then returning that. And then within insert employee method, so obviously this method is going to receive an employee object which we are adding to the employees collection, and then calling save changes on employee DB context object. And then this is our update employee method where we are passing the employee object that we want to update. So this object is going to contain all the changes. So again, we are retrieving the object that we want to update based on the ID of the passed in object. So we are taking the ID of the passed in object and comparing that with the objects that we have within this collection and retrieving that object. So this is the object that we want to update, and then we are setting first name, last name, all the properties basically. I think here we actually missed last name property, so let's go ahead and set that. Right, so that's our update employee method. And then delete employee, the same idea. This object is going to contain the ID of the employee object that we want to delete. We'll retrieve that from the database collection objects and then delete that. And then finally call save changes. So straightforward employee repository class. Alright, to this project, let's also add a web form. And then on this web form, we need a grid view control. First of all, let's set the style attribute. Let's set font family to Arial. And let's flip this to the design mode. We need a grid view control. And we need a details view control. And an object data source control. Okay, so let's go ahead and build our solution. And first, let's configure our object data source control. So here the business object is going to be our employee repository class, and keep in mind that class has methods to select, insert, update, and delete employees. So on the next screen, we are going to specify the select method, so get employees. The update method is going to be update employee. The insert method is going to be insert employee, and delete method is going to be delete employee. Let's click finish, and then now let's configure the grid view control. So let's auto format this. Let's select colorful scheme, and let's select the data source control, object data source, and we want to enable editing and deleting. Right, and one more thing that we need to do is we need to specify the key column using data key names property, and that is going to be employee ID. And we don't want employee ID column to be editable, so I'm going to go into the source and then set, here is the bound field, employee ID bound field. So we are going to set this read only attribute to true so that it will not be editable when the grid view is in edit mode. So now let's go ahead and configure the details view control. So first of all, let's auto format this, select the colorful scheme, and let's select the data source as object data source, and we want to enable inserting. And first of all, we don't want this employee ID to be visible, so let's go to the source mode, and then we're going to set insert visible equals false. So when we are trying to insert an employee, we don't have to supply a value for employee ID, so we are setting that attribute to false. Alright, and the default mode for this details view is going to be insert. So let's go ahead and specify that as well. It's going to be insert. Alright, and then one last thing that we need to do, we are going to use this details view to insert an employee. As soon as we have inserted an employee, item inserted event is fired. So within the event handler, we are going to refresh the grid view control so that the newly inserted row will be displayed within the grid view control. Alright, so with all these changes, let's actually run this. But before we run this, let's flip to SQL Server Management Studio. At the moment, I already have sample database, so let's go ahead and delete the database. So now we don't have sample database. And one more thing that we need to do is in our web.config file, we need to specify a connection string to our database. And again, in the interest of time, I have already typed the connection string, so let's copy and paste that right here. So that's the name of the connection string, which matches the name of the DB context class. In our case, it's employee DB context, so it matches with the name of this connection string. And then this is the connection string, and we have to specify the provider name as well, and we have discussed the importance of that in the previous sessions of this video series. So with all these changes, let's go ahead and run this web form and see if it's going to create the sample database. So code first, by default, it should create the sample database, and it should also create the employees table. Okay, so here we have not customized the model generation in any way. So by default, for this employee entity, it's going to create one table called employees, and all these properties will be converted into columns. So let's actually look at that. So let's refresh this databases folder. So we have the sample database and then employees table, and look at that, we have all the columns there. Okay, now we want to do entity splitting. So we want to map this entity to two or more tables. So basically, the employee contact information, that is email, mobile, and landline, we want that to be present in employee contact details table along with the primary key, which is employee ID. And then employee ID, first name, last name, and gender, we want that to be present in employees table. So basically, we want this entity, this single entity, to be mapped to these two tables. So we want the code first approach to automatically generate two different tables for this entity. So we want to override the default model generation, and in order to do that, we are going to override this on model creating method, and this method is present in the DB context class. And if you look at our employee DB context class right here, that is inheriting from DB context. So within this employee DB context class, we are going to override on model creating method. And notice this method receives a parameter called model binder. So using this object, we are going to specify the names of the tables that we want our employee entity to be mapped to, and we can also specify the names of columns within those tables as well. So this is how the on model creating method is going to look like. So we have the model builder. So model builder dot entity. So we want to map the employee entity. So we are going to use the map method. So we are first mapping the properties. So employee ID, first name, last name, and gender. These properties of the employee entity should be mapped to this table employees. Okay, and then these properties right here, employee ID, email, mobile, and landline, these properties should be mapped to this table, employee contact details. And by default in both the tables, this employee ID is going to be the primary key. Okay, so in the interest of time, I have already typed that code, so let me copy and paste this within our on model creating method. Okay, so it's exactly the same code on the slide. And let's format this. Alright, so now let's actually delete the sample database that we have already generated. Right, now let's run this one more time. So now Entity Framework should create two tables for that single employee entity. And that entity should be mapped to both of those tables anyway. So when we perform insert, update, and deletes, the data should be inserted appropriately into both the tables. So let's flip to SQL Server Management Studio, refresh the databases. So now look at this, we got two tables, and if you look at employee contact details, it has got employee ID, all the contact information, email, mobile, and landline. And if you look at employees table, it has got employee ID, first name, last name, and gender. Now let's go ahead and execute this insert script to insert some test data into those tables. Okay, alright, so we have some test data there, so let's refresh this page. So look at this, the grid view is displaying data from both of the tables, and then let's quickly edit this. Let's say Mark X, Hastings X. Let's put an X everywhere and then click update. So let's quickly select the data from both the tables and see if the tables are updated. Look at that, both the tables are updated as expected. Now let's actually delete that row and see if it gets deleted from both the rows, from both the tables I mean. So look at that, row 1 got deleted from both the tables. Let's insert a new row. Let's call X everywhere. Okay, look at that, it's already added. So let's check the tables. Look at that, first name, last name, gender, email, mobile, landline, and both the rows has the same key column, which is employee ID. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.